Major General Patricia Holloway's fist swung toward Lieutenant Commander Natasha Rivera's face with deliberate force. The gymnasium fell silent. 200 personnel stood frozen, their eyes wide in disbelief at what they were witnessing. The general's knuckles were inches away when Natasha's hand snapped up with the reflexive speed of 2 decades of combat training. She caught his wrist mid-strike, her grip iron solid, her eyes locked on his with absolute calm. The room collectively held its breath. For a moment, neither of them moved. General Holloway's face flushed crimson as he realized what had just happened. A 3-star general, a man accustomed to absolute authority, unquestioned command, and unwavering respect, had just thrown a punch at a subordinate officer, and that officer had stopped it as effortlessly as swatting away a child's push. The humiliation burned across his features like wildfire. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. What the hell? Holloway yanked his arm back, trying to regain some semblance of control. Natasha released him immediately, stepping back with perfect military bearing. Her expression remained neutral, professional, unshaken. She didn't say a word. She didn't need to. The silent message was clear in her eyes. I've faced far worse than this, General, and I won. A nervous murmur rippled through the crowd. Some of the younger officers exchanged shocked glances. The senior enlisted personnel, the ones who'd been around long enough to know better, stood perfectly still, understanding that something significant had just shifted in this room. One of the drill sergeants actually bit his lip, trying to suppress what might have been a smile. General Holloway straightened his uniform with sharp, jerky movements. His jaw clenched so tightly a vein stood out on his temple. He was a man unaccustomed to being challenged, much less physically thwarted by a woman under his command. His eyes blazed with something between rage and embarrassment. "Stand down, Rivera," he barked, his voice tight and controlled, but with an edge of something darker underneath. That was unexpected. Natasha maintained her position at attention, her posture perfect, her breathing steady. There was no triumph in her expression, no satisfaction. She was a professional, and she would conduct herself as such, regardless of what had just transpired. Holloway turned to address the assembled personnel, clearly trying to regain authority and reframe what had just occurred. "What you've witnessed today is a valuable lesson," he said, his voice regaining some of its commanding tone, though it still carried an edge of irritation. "Combat training can be unpredictable. Real threats come from unexpected angles. A soldier must always be ready to defend, to react to." But even as he spoke, Natasha noticed the way his eyes kept returning to her. There was something in that gaze, something calculating, something dangerous. She'd seen that look before in her 20 years of service. It was the look of a man whose ego had been wounded, and who was already scheming how to restore his wounded pride. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to Military Excellence Stories so you never miss these inspiring tales of courage and integrity. And tell us in the comments where you're watching from today. Just 3 weeks earlier, Natasha had been sitting in a secure briefing room deep beneath the Pentagon in Arlington, Virginia. She'd arrived 15 minutes early, as she always did, and sat alone with her thoughts at a polished mahogany table. The gentle hum of air conditioning filled the silence as she waited, her posture impeccable, her hands folded to conceal the faint tremor of anticipation. She was expecting bad news, the kind that came with classified briefing rooms and high-ranking officials. 20 years. 20 years of service. 20 years of deployments, of combat zones, of leading teams through impossible situations. 20 years of proving herself in an organization that still, even now in the 21st century, harbored officers who questioned whether women belonged in special operations. Natasha had earned her place through blood, sweat, and sacrifice. She'd lost friends. She'd carried wounded teammates out of hostile fire. She'd made life-and-death decisions that kept her people alive. And now, 3 weeks ago, she'd been reassigned. New command. New location, the Consolidated Defense Training Center just outside of New Jersey. A facility she'd never heard of before, reporting directly to Major General Patricia Holloway, a man with a reputation that preceded him like a storm front. The heavy oak door swung open and Admiral Richard Thornton stepped inside. Natasha stood at attention, but the Admiral gestured for her to sit. He looked tired, the kind of tired that came from knowing difficult truths and having to deliver them carefully. "Lieutenant Commander Rivera," he began, settling himself into a chair across from her. "I'm going to be direct with you. At the training facility where you've just been assigned, there have been concerns. Quiet concerns. Nothing official, nothing with names attached, but concerns nonetheless." Natasha's jaw tightened slightly. She'd heard whispers about General Holloway over the years. Whispers about his training methods being overly aggressive. Whispers about his philosophy that soft training created weak soldiers. Whispers that he believed the line between rigorous instruction and abuse was something to be tested, probed, and occasionally crossed. "What kind of concerns, sir?" she asked carefully. Admiral Thornton pulled out a photograph and slid it across the table. It showed General Holloway in dress uniform, his face stern and confident. But there was something in his expression, a hardness, a coldness that went beyond military discipline. "Reports of excessive force during training exercises," Thornton said quietly. "Trainees with injuries that go beyond what would be expected from standard instruction. Officers who've complained, then mysteriously retracted their complaints. And 6 months ago, a promising young officer died during a routine drill at that facility. The official report called it an accident, a structural failure during a climbing exercise." "And unofficially?" Natasha asked, though she already sensed the answer. "Unofficially, I don't believe in coincidences," Thornton replied, meeting her eyes. "General Holloway has been operating that facility with minimal oversight for 7 years. He's built a culture there that values toughness above all else. Some would say he's created a monster, a place where the line between training and torture has become dangerously blurred." Natasha leaned back slightly, processing this information. A training facility run by an aggressive general. Questionable deaths ruled as accidents. Complaints that disappeared. It was exactly the kind of institutional rot she'd encountered before, protected by rank, enabled by silence, perpetuated by fear. "Why are you telling me this, sir?" she asked. Thornton's expression was grave. "Because I need someone inside that facility who can see what's really happening. Someone with enough experience to recognize the difference between rigorous training and abuse. Someone with the credibility to report what they find. And someone with the backbone to stand up to Holloway if necessary." He paused, letting his words settle. "I need you to go in there, Lieutenant Commander. Spend 90 days. Observe. Document. And if what I suspect is happening is really happening, I need you to help me stop it." Natasha hadn't hesitated. She'd accepted the assignment immediately. Not because she wanted to put herself in potential danger. She'd had enough of that over 20 years. But because she recognized injustice when she heard it described, and she'd spent her entire career standing against it. Now, 3 weeks into her assignment, she understood exactly what Admiral Thornton had meant. And as she stood in that gymnasium, with 200 eyes upon her, and General Holloway's wounded pride radiating off him like heat from a furnace, she realized that the real test was about to begin. Holloway dismissed the gathering, but as the personnel filed out, Natasha felt his gaze burning into her back. She could practically hear his thoughts. "Who does she think she is? How dare she embarrass me in front of my own command?" He had no idea. He had no idea that the woman he'd just tried to strike had spent 2 decades in America's most elite fighting force. He had no idea that she'd faced down enemies in 6 different countries. He had no idea that his amateur attempt at intimidation was nothing compared to what she'd already survived. And he had absolutely no idea that by throwing that punch, he'd just made a terrible mistake. Because Natasha Rivera was exactly the kind of woman who didn't forget, who didn't back down, who didn't accept injustice in silence. General Holloway had awakened something in that gymnasium, and before this was over, he would understand the true meaning of respect, and the terrible cost of disrespecting a woman who'd spent 20 years earning hers. The incident in the gymnasium spread through the facility like wildfire. By that evening, every officer, Every enlisted person, every instructor at the Consolidated Defense Training Center knew that General Holloway had attempted to strike Lieutenant Commander Rivera and that she'd effortlessly stopped him. The story was told in hushed conversations in the barracks, in careful whispers in the break rooms, and in charged silence in the command corridors where ranking officers pretended not to discuss it. Natasha knew the political minefield she'd just entered. A three-star general didn't forget humiliation. He didn't forgive it, and he certainly didn't let it go unanswered. She expected retaliation. She expected him to find ways to make her assignment at the facility as difficult as possible. What she didn't expect was to discover exactly how deep the rot at this place truly went. That evening, Natasha sat alone in her temporary quarters, a sparse officer's room with a single bed, a desk, and a small window overlooking the training grounds. She was reviewing the facility's training schedules and personnel files when a soft knock came at her door. She checked her watch. 2,145 hours. Well past normal visiting hours. She opened the door to find Captain Derek Walsh standing in the corridor, his uniform immaculate but his eyes betraying a nervous tension. Walsh was one of the senior training officers at the facility, a man in his mid-40s with 15 years of military service. He glanced over his shoulder before speaking. "Commander Rivera, I apologize for the late hour," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I need to speak with you. Not here. Will you walk with me?" Natasha's instincts immediately shifted to high alert. This was either a trap or an opportunity. Either way, she needed to find out which. "Of course, Captain," she replied, grabbing a light jacket. They walked through the dimly lit corridors of the facility and eventually found themselves outside, moving toward the perimeter of the training grounds where the outdoor obstacle courses sat dark and silent under the stars. Walsh kept his pace steady, his eyes forward, his voice measured. "What you did today in the gymnasium," he began, "stopping the general strike. That took either incredible courage or incredible foolishness. I haven't decided which yet." "Which do you think it is?" Natasha asked. "I think it was necessary," Walsh said. He stopped walking and turned to face her. "And I think it's time someone told you the truth about why you're really here. Admiral Thornton didn't send you here just to observe General Holloway's methods. He sent you here because he suspects something much darker than aggressive training." Natasha waited. She'd learned over 20 years that sometimes the most important information came when you simply let people speak. Walsh took a breath, as if steeling himself for what he was about to say. 18 months ago, a captain named Michael Reeves was assigned to this facility. He was a good officer, decorated, experienced, exactly the kind of person who should have been mentoring our junior personnel. He noticed inconsistencies in the training protocols. He saw evidence that General Holloway was pushing trainees well beyond safe limits. He documented instances of severe injuries that were being classified as minor training accidents. "What happened to him?" Natasha asked, though she already suspected the answer wouldn't be good. Captain Reeves went to General Holloway with his concerns. He presented evidence. He was professional about it. He gave the general a chance to address the issues internally. Walsh's jaw tightened. 2 weeks later, Reeves was dead. The official report called it an accident during a rappelling exercise. A faulty harness. A structural failure at the anchor point. Natasha felt something cold settle in her chest. "And unofficially?" "Unofficially, I watched that harness before the exercise," Walsh said, his voice dropping even lower. "It was perfect. Military-grade equipment, recently inspected, completely functional. I know equipment, Commander. I know when something is wrong with it. That harness was not wrong. It was sabotaged." "And no one reported this?" Natasha asked, though the question was more rhetorical than genuine. She already knew the answer. "I tried," Walsh said. His face looked pained, haunted. "I reported it to the chain of command. I documented everything I'd observed. But here's the thing about General Holloway. He's had this facility for 7 years. He's carefully built a network of loyalists, officers who believe in his methods, officers who benefit from his protection. When I filed my report, it disappeared. Not figuratively, literally. It vanished from the system. The next day, I was told my report had been misfiled, that there was confusion about the procedures, that everything would be sorted out. It wasn't sorted out, Natasha said. No, it wasn't. Instead, I was reassigned to administrative duties, desk work, pushing papers, effectively sidelined. Walsh's hands clenched into fists, and Captain Reeves stayed dead, and General Holloway continued running this facility exactly as he always had. They walked in silence for a moment. Natasha processed this information, connecting it to what Admiral Thornton had told her. A death ruled accidental, a suspicious harness, a cover-up, a culture of silence protected by rank and power. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked finally. "Because I've been waiting for someone like you," Walsh said. "Someone with credibility. Someone who can't be easily intimidated or sidelined. Someone who's proven, literally today, that they won't back down from General Holloway." He paused. "And because Captain Reeves deserves justice. His family deserves answers. And this facility needs to be cleaned up before another good person dies, because General Holloway believes that domination through fear and pain is the same as building strength. If you report this officially, Holloway will destroy you," Natasha said. It wasn't a question. "I know," Walsh replied. "That's why I'm not reporting it. You are." Natasha understood what he was asking. More than that, she understood the cost of refusing. Another death covered up. Another family left without answers. Another monster in a uniform, continuing to operate with impunity. "I'll need everything you have," she said. "Every document, every observation, every piece of evidence." "I have it," Walsh said. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a flash drive. "Everything I documented on Reeves' death. Everything I observed about the other injuries and incidents. Timestamps, dates, names of witnesses. It's all here." Natasha took the drive. It felt impossibly small in her hand, yet it contained the weight of a dead officer's legacy. "If this comes out," Walsh said, "Holloway will know I was involved. My career will be over." "I know," Natasha said, "and I'm asking you to do it anyway." Walsh met her eyes. For a moment, he looked like he was carrying the weight of the entire world. Then slowly he nodded. "Reeves was a good man," he said quietly. "He deserved better. So did the people he was trying to protect. Then help me give them that," Natasha said. They walked back toward the facility in silence. When they reached the building, Walsh paused before heading back inside. "Be careful, Commander," he said. "General Holloway is dangerous. And now that you've humiliated him, he's going to be even more unpredictable. He'll see you as a threat. He may try to discredit you, to find dirt on you, to force you out before you can do any real damage." "Let him try," Natasha replied. She'd faced down enemies far more dangerous than a wounded general. "I've been preparing for this my entire life." As Walsh disappeared back into the facility, Natasha looked down at the flash drive in her hand. Captain Michael Reeves' last testament. Evidence of a cover-up. Proof that General Holloway's facility was far more dangerous than anyone in official channels had been willing to acknowledge. The next morning, Natasha would contact Admiral Thornton with what she'd learned. The game would shift from observation to action, and General Holloway, still believing himself invulnerable behind the shield of his rank and authority, would have no idea that the woman he'd tried to strike was already moving against him with the precision and determination that only 20 years of special operations training could provide. The reckoning was beginning, and this time there would be no cover-up. This time there would be justice. Natasha waited until dawn broke over the facility before she made the encrypted call to Admiral Thornton. She used her personal phone, connected through a secure VPN that she'd set up specifically for communications that needed to remain off the official radar. The general's network was extensive, but even his reach had limits. What he didn't know, what he couldn't monitor, was the depth of her connections within the highest levels of military command. The admiral answered on the second ring. There was no preamble, no greeting. In their world, there rarely was. "I have information," Natasha said without inflection. "Tell me," Thornton replied. Natasha recounted everything that Captain Walsh had told her. The sabotaged harness, The disappeared report. The witnesses who had been silenced through reassignment and intimidation. The pattern of injuries classified as training accidents. The institutional machinery that had been deliberately constructed to protect General Holloway and his methods from outside scrutiny. When she finished, there was a long silence on the other end of the line. "Captain Walsh is credible?" Thornton asked finally. "Completely. He's a decorated officer with no axe to grind except the truth. And he's providing documentation. Everything he observed. Everything he documented about Captain Reeves' death. He's putting his career on the line," Thornton said. "It wasn't a question. He is. He understands the consequences. He's willing to testify officially when the time comes, but he's also terrified. Not for himself, but for his family. He knows what General Holloway is capable of." Thornton took a breath. "Natasha, what I'm about to ask you is significant. What I'm about to propose comes with real danger, real risk, and I need you to understand the full scope of what you're agreeing to before you commit." Natasha had suspected this moment was coming. From the day Thornton had assigned her to the facility, she'd known that this conversation was inevitable. The question was whether she had the courage to say yes. "I'm listening," she said. "General Holloway has been operating that facility with effectively zero oversight for 7 years. Thornton began. "He's built a power structure around himself. Officers who believe in his methods, who benefit from his protection, who have a vested interest in maintaining the status quo. Captain Reeves was a threat to that structure because he tried to work within the system. He filed reports. He went through proper channels. And that made him vulnerable. He's dead because he did everything right," Natasha said quietly. "Yes, and no one at that facility dared challenge Holloway after that. The message was clear. Step out of line and you disappear. Not literally, though Reeves' death was made to look like an accident. But your career disappears. Your credibility disappears. Your ability to advocate for change disappears." Natasha understood what he was saying. Holloway had created an environment of fear so complete that no one dared oppose him. "You need someone who can't be easily eliminated," Thornton continued. "Someone with enough rank that removing them would raise questions. Someone with credibility that can't be damaged by whisper campaigns or reassignment. Someone who understands military culture deeply enough to navigate the politics while pursuing the truth." "You need someone like me," Natasha said. "I need someone exactly like you," Thornton replied. "I'm asking you to formalize what you're already doing. I'm going to have you officially tasked with a 120-day comprehensive evaluation of the facility's training protocols. The evaluation will be thorough, invasive, and completely legitimate. You'll have the authority to access all records, interview all personnel, and compile a detailed report on whether the facility is operating in compliance with military safety standards." "And if I find what we already suspect I'll find?" Natasha asked. "Then you'll have irrefutable documentation. You'll have your official evaluation to point to. You'll have the legitimacy of the command structure behind your findings. And we'll use that documentation to ensure that every officer involved in the cover-up faces accountability." Natasha walked to her window and looked out across the training grounds. She could see the rappelling tower in the distance, the structure from which Captain Reeves had fallen. She could see the obstacle courses where trainees were being pushed beyond safe limits. She could see the gymnasium where, just yesterday, General Holloway had attempted to strike her and had discovered, to his humiliation, that he'd chosen the wrong woman to intimidate. "There's something you should understand, Admiral," Natasha said. "When I was 18 years old, I tried to join the Navy SEALs. I was told women weren't allowed. I was told I was physically incapable. I was told I should focus on becoming a nurse or a teacher, something more suitable to my gender. So I waited. I trained. I became stronger. And 4 years later, I became the first woman to successfully complete SEAL training." She paused, letting that sink in. "For 20 years, I've operated in spaces where I wasn't supposed to exist. I've survived in environments that were designed to break people. I've faced enemies who were absolutely certain they could kill me, and I'm still here. General Holloway thinks he's a predator operating in his own domain. but he has no idea what he's actually dealing with. I understand, Thornton said, but I need to be clear about the dangers. This isn't going to be a simple investigation. Holloway is going to fight back. He's going to use every tool at his disposal. He's going to try to discredit you, to find dirt on you, to make the investigation politically untenable. And if he believes you're a genuine threat, he's going to escalate. Let him escalate, Natasha said. I've been escalated against before. I've survived worse than a wounded general with a wounded ego and a power base that's built on fear. You understand that if this goes wrong, if we can't make the charges stick, if the investigation falls apart, Holloway will ensure you never serve another day in the military? Yes, Natasha said, and I'm doing it anyway. There was another long silence. Then Thornton spoke, and his voice carried a weight of emotion that wasn't normally present in their professional communications. Captain Reeves saved 12 lives during his final deployment, he said quietly. He was a mentor to younger officers. He had a wife and 2 children. He was the kind of officer this military needs more of, not less. And he was killed because he had the integrity to report what was wrong with his command structure. Then let's make sure his death meant something, Natasha replied. I'm authorizing you to proceed, Thornton said. Effective immediately, you are formally tasked with a comprehensive 120-day evaluation of the Consolidated Defense Training Center's operations and protocols. You will have full authority to access all records, conduct interviews with all personnel, and compile a detailed report to be submitted to the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Your evaluation is to be thorough, professional, and conclusive. Understood, Admiral, Natasha said. One more thing, Thornton added. When you move against Holloway, and you will move against him, make sure it's irrefutable. Make sure the evidence is so overwhelming that no one can explain it away, deny it, or cover it up. Make sure that when it becomes public, there's no question about the truth. I will, Natasha assured him. And Natasha? Thornton's voice was different now. More personal, more concerned. Be careful. Holloway attempted to strike you once. Next time, if he feels cornered, he might not stop at a punch. Natasha ended the call and stood for a long moment, looking out at the facility that was about to become the center of her world for the next 4 months. She thought about Captain Reeves. She thought about the trainees who had been pushed beyond safe limits. She thought about the families of officers who had been injured or killed under circumstances that had been officially ruled as accidents. And she thought about General Holloway, who had absolutely no idea that the woman he tried to strike was now officially tasked with investigating every detail of his command. The real work was about to begin. The formal evaluation began on a Monday morning with what appeared to be routine administrative procedures. Natasha submitted her official tasking to the facility's command center, including the authorization letter from Admiral Thornton and the Joint Chiefs of Staff. The letter was carefully worded, professional, bureaucratic, impossible to challenge without raising red flags about why anyone would want to obstruct a comprehensive evaluation. General Holloway received the notification within the hour. Natasha observed his reaction from a distance, watching as his face darkened when he read the document. She could practically see the calculations happening behind his eyes. An evaluation meant scrutiny. Scrutiny meant exposure. And exposure meant consequences he'd managed to avoid for 7 years. He called an all-hands meeting in the main conference room that afternoon. Natasha sat in the back, her notebook open, her expression neutral, watching everything. Approximately 150 personnel filled the room: officers, enlisted personnel, instructors, administrative staff. Everyone who worked at the facility. General Holloway stood at the front of the room in his dress uniform, his bearing impeccable, his face arranged into an expression of casual authority. But his eyes were hard, calculating, angry. As many of you are aware, the facility has been selected for a comprehensive operational evaluation, he announced, his voice steady and controlled. Lieutenant Commander Rivera will be conducting this evaluation over the next 120 days. She will have access to all facilities, all records, and the authority to interview any personnel she deems necessary. He paused, letting his gaze sweep across the room before landing on Natasha. I want to be clear about something, he continued. This evaluation is an opportunity for this facility to demonstrate the excellence of our training programs and the professionalism of our personnel. I expect full cooperation from everyone in this room. I expect honesty. I expect transparency. And I expect that anyone who is interviewed will present an accurate picture of the facility's operations. There was something in the way he said those last words that made the air in the room grow heavier. It wasn't a threat, not explicitly, but everyone understood the subtext. Be careful what you say. Be careful what you report. Be careful not to cause problems. Natasha made note of the officers whose expressions shifted when Holloway spoke. She identified the people who exchanged nervous glances with one another. She recognized the body language of people who were afraid. That was her starting point. Fear made people either silent or willing to talk. She just had to figure out which category each person fell into. After the meeting ended, Natasha set up a temporary office in one of the facility's administrative buildings. It was a small space, desk, computer, filing cabinets, secure phone line. But it was hers, and it was separate from Holloway's command structure. The first thing she did was request all personnel files, all training logs, all incident reports, and all medical records from the past 5 years. She wanted to see patterns. She wanted to understand the breadth of what had been happening at this facility under Holloway's watch. The requests began the next morning, and almost immediately she encountered resistance. Captain James Stratton, the facility's administrative officer, delivered the first set of files personally. He was a cautious man in his early 50s, with carefully combed gray hair and the demeanor of someone who'd learned to navigate military bureaucracy by staying invisible. "Commander," he said, setting the boxes of files on her desk with deliberate care, "we have some concerns about the scope of your requests. Some of these records contain sensitive information about ongoing training protocols. There are privacy considerations regarding personnel medical records. We're wondering if we might need to establish some parameters around what information is provided to the evaluation." It was a classic obstruction tactic. Challenge the authority. Raise procedural concerns. Create delays. "Captain Stratton," Natasha replied, keeping her voice professional and calm, "my authorization comes directly from the Joint Chiefs of Staff. That authorization supersedes facility-level concerns about information sharing. All records related to training protocols, personnel safety, and medical incidents are within the scope of my evaluation. If you have specific privacy concerns, I'm happy to establish appropriate security protocols to protect sensitive information, but I will have access to all the files." Stratton's jaw tightened slightly. "I'll need to consult with General Holloway about this." "Of course," Natasha said. "And when you do, you can let him know that any obstruction of this evaluation will be documented and included in my final report to the Joint Chiefs. I'm sure they'll be very interested in understanding why a commander would resist transparency." Stratton left without another word. But the message was clear. She was willing to use her authority, and she wouldn't be intimidated. Over the next week, Natasha began systematically reviewing the facility's records. What she found was worse than she'd expected. There were dozens of incident reports describing injuries sustained during training. Trainees hospitalized for broken bones, severe lacerations, internal injuries. Some of these incidents were classified as training accidents. Others were simply missing from the official logs entirely. She found evidence of training sessions that occurred off the books, in the evenings and on weekends, sessions that didn't appear in the facility's official schedule. She found maintenance records for the rappelling equipment that showed routine inspections but no detailed documentation of the actual condition of the equipment. She found medical records that had been partially redacted, with entire sections blocked out or removed. It was a systematic pattern of documentation designed to obscure rather than illuminate. Every record that might have raised questions had been carefully managed, edited, or eliminated. It was the work of someone who understood the military system well enough to manipulate it, who knew exactly which strings to pull to ensure that problems disappeared into bureaucratic fog. By the end of the second week, Natasha had filled 4 notebooks with observations, questions, and potential leads. She'd identified 7 trainees who had sustained significant injuries during training exercises. She'd located the names of 3 officers who had requested transfers away from the facility after complaining about training conditions. She'd found evidence of at least a dozen training incidents that had been downgraded or reclassified to appear less serious than they actually were. But she still needed direct testimony. She needed people willing to speak on record about what they'd witnessed. And that's where the real challenge lay. She began scheduling interviews with facility personnel, starting with junior enlisted staff and working her way up the chain of command. The first 5 interviews were essentially useless. Personnel gave minimal answers, stuck to official narratives, and clearly understood that any criticism of the facility or its commander would come back to haunt them. But the 6th interview was different. Petty Officer 2nd Class Marcus Hendricks was a training instructor, a man in his early 30s with broad shoulders and the bearing of someone who'd spent his entire adult life in the military. He came to her office nervous, his hands working together in front of him, his eyes carefully avoiding direct contact. Petty Officer Hendricks, Natasha began, keeping her voice gentle and non-threatening. Thank you for making time for this interview. I want you to understand that this is a safe space to discuss your observations about the facility's training programs. Everything you say is confidential, and you're protected from retaliation under Military Regulation 5-27A. Hendricks looked up at her, uncertainty written across his face. I need to know what's really happening here, Natasha continued quietly. I need to understand the training environment that General Holloway has created. And I believe you can help me understand that. For a long moment, Hendricks said nothing. Then, slowly, he began to speak. He described training sessions where General Holloway personally oversaw exercises, pushing trainees past the point where safety protocols would normally require stopping. He described injuries that occurred regularly during these sessions. He described the culture of silence that Holloway had cultivated, the understanding that if you reported injuries or complained about excessive force, you would find yourself reassigned, demoted, or driven out of the military entirely. He described witnessing the rappelling exercise where Captain Reeves had fallen. He described noticing that the harness had been manipulated, though he'd been too afraid to say anything at the time. He described watching the aftermath, watching as Holloway's network had sprung into action to ensure that questions were minimized and the incident was quickly classified as an accident. And he described living with the guilt of his silence for 18 months, knowing that Holloway was still operating, still pushing trainees too hard, still creating an environment where death was an acceptable cost of the general's vision of military training. By the time the interview ended, Hendricks was crying. But he was also committed. He would testify. He would go on record. He would help expose what was happening at the facility. Natasha had her first real witness. And with Hendricks' willingness to speak, the dam began to crack. Over the next 3 weeks, more personnel came forward. More stories emerged. More evidence accumulated. The picture that emerged was of a facility operating under a commander who had abandoned all ethical constraints in pursuit of his own twisted vision of military strength. And Natasha was methodically documenting every detail. By the 4th week of the evaluation, Natasha's office had become an unofficial refuge for personnel willing to speak truthfully about conditions at the facility. Petty Officer Hendricks' willingness to testify had created a psychological shift. If one person could stand up without facing immediate retaliation, maybe others could too. Word spread quietly through the facility's underground communication network, the kind that existed in every military installation, passed through whispers in hallways and careful conversations in remote corners of the training grounds. But it was a conversation with one person that changed everything. Major Catherine Chun arrived at Natasha's office at 1900 hours, well after normal working hours. Chun was the facility's deputy commander, the second highest ranking officer at the facility after Holloway himself. She was a woman in her mid-40s with a reputation for being sharp, professional, and completely dedicated to military protocol. She was also, by all accounts, one of Holloway's closest confidants. Or at least that's what everyone assumed. Natasha looked up from her desk when Chun knocked softly on the door. The major's face was carefully arranged into a neutral expression, but her eyes betrayed tension. "Commander Rivera," Chun said quietly, closing the door behind her. "I need to speak with you confidentially." And I need your assurance that this conversation will be documented in a way that protects my identity until I'm ready to come forward publicly." Natasha gestured for Chun to sit. She'd learned over 20 years that sometimes the most important information came from the people closest to power, the people who had a front-row seat to corruption but had been too afraid or too invested to challenge it. "Of course, Major," Natasha replied. "Everything you tell me is protected under the evaluation protocols. Your identity remains confidential until you authorize otherwise." Chun took a deep breath, as if she was gathering courage from somewhere deep inside herself. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet but steady. "I've known General Holloway for 18 years, she began. "We came up through the ranks together. I've served under his command for the past 7 years here at this facility. And I've watched him become something that I barely recognize anymore." Natasha said nothing. She simply listened, her notebook open, her pen poised to record the words that were about to change everything. "When we first arrived here, General Holloway was different," Chun continued. "He was demanding, yes. He had high standards for himself and for his personnel. But there was a line. He understood where rigorous training ended and abuse began. He understood that the goal of military training is to build strong warriors, not to break people." Chun paused, her hands clenching and unclenching in her lap. Somewhere along the way, that line started to blur. Gradually at first. A training exercise that pushed a little too hard. A trainee who got injured in a way that seemed consistent with the training, but afterward felt staged. Incidents that were immediately classified as accidents before any real investigation could occur. "Captain Reeves," Natasha said quietly. "Captain Reeves," Chun confirmed, her voice breaking slightly. "Michael and I were friends. Not close friends, but we served together on committees. We'd have conversations about training philosophy. He was a good officer, a principled officer. And he was killed because he had the integrity to report what was wrong with General Holloway's command." "You witnessed the rappelling exercise?" Natasha asked. "Not directly, but I was present when the incident was being handled. I was in the command center when the report came through, and I actually watched, as General Holloway made certain that specific details were omitted from the official documentation. I heard him tell Captain Stratton to classify the incident as equipment failure rather than anything that might suggest human error or misconduct." Chen's hands trembled as she spoke. "I should have reported it," she said, her voice filled with recrimination. "I should have gone up the chain of command. I should have documented everything and made a formal complaint. But I didn't. I rationalized it. I told myself that I was misinterpreting what I was seeing. I told myself that Holloway was still a good commander making difficult decisions in a complex situation. I told myself a lot of things that weren't true because accepting the truth would have meant that I had to act." "But you're acting now," Natasha said gently. "Because I can't live with the silence anymore," Chun replied, her eyes wet. "Because there's been another incident. 2 weeks ago, during an off-the-books training session, a young lieutenant was pushed so hard that she collapsed. She had to be rushed to the medical center. The official record says she experienced heat exhaustion during a routine drill. But I was there. I saw what happened. Holloway deliberately pushed her past the point of safe exertion. And when she collapsed, his first concern wasn't for her health. His first concern was how to ensure the incident wouldn't become a problem for him." Natasha absorbed this information carefully. Another victim, another cover-up. Another piece of evidence that this wasn't just about one isolated incident. This was systematic. This was intentional. This was a pattern of behavior that Holloway had perfected over years of operation at this facility. "The lieutenant," Natasha said. "Is she willing to testify?" "Her name is Lieutenant Sarah Mackenzie. She's young, only been in the military for 3 years. She's terrified. She knows that testifying against the general will essentially end her career at this facility, possibly end her entire military career. But she's also angry. She's also realizing that what happened to her was intentional, not an accident, not a miscalculation. It was deliberate abuse by a commander she was supposed to be able to trust." "I need to speak with her," Natasha said. "I know. and I'm willing to help facilitate that conversation. But you need to understand what you're asking of her. She's junior enlisted. She has limited recourse if Holloway decides to make her life difficult. She doesn't have the rank or the credibility that you have. She's vulnerable in ways that you're not. I understand, Natasha said, and I'll make sure she understands what testifying means. But I won't force her. This has to be her choice. Chun nodded slowly. Then she reached into her jacket and pulled out a folder. Inside were copies of documents, training logs, medical records, incident reports. But these weren't the sanitized versions that Natasha had received through official channels. These were the originals, the unredacted versions. The documents that showed the full truth of what had occurred at the facility. I've been collecting these for months, Chun said. Every time I witnessed something that didn't feel right, I made a copy. Every time I saw documentation being altered or classified in a way that seemed inappropriate, I documented it. I was trying to build a case, not because I was planning to do anything with it, but because I needed the evidence to exist. I needed to know that somewhere, the truth was recorded, even if no one ever saw it. Major Chun, Natasha said carefully, by providing me with these documents, you're essentially testifying against your commanding officer. You understand the implications? I do, Chun replied, and I'm ready to face them. Michael Reeves deserves justice. Lieutenant Mackenzie deserves to have her incident taken seriously. And General Holloway needs to face consequences for what he's done. I've spent the last 18 months telling myself that staying silent was the professional thing to do. But staying silent has just allowed him to hurt more people. So yes, I'm ready. I'm ready to go on record. I'm ready to testify. I'm ready to do whatever it takes to ensure that this facility is cleaned up and that Holloway is held accountable. Over the next 3 days, Natasha met with Lieutenant Sarah Mackenzie. The young officer was nervous, frightened, but also determined. She described the training session in detail, how General Holloway had personally overseen it, how he'd deliberately ignored her statements that she was experiencing physical distress, how he'd pushed her to the point of collapse. She provided medical records showing the severity of her condition when she'd been admitted to the medical center. She identified witnesses to the incident. She was willing to testify. With Major Chen's documentation and Lieutenant Mackenzie's testimony, Natasha now had multiple layers of evidence. She had witnesses willing to speak on record. She had official documents that contradicted the sanitized versions that had been filed. She had proof of a pattern that extended far beyond a single incident. And she had someone on the inside, the deputy commander herself, willing to testify against the facility's leader. The investigation had just entered a new phase, and General Holloway was running out of time before the truth caught up with him. By week 6 of the evaluation, Natasha's temporary office had transformed into the nerve center of what was rapidly becoming the most comprehensive investigation into General Holloway's command that had ever been conducted. The walls were now covered with timelines, photographs of injuries, copies of incident reports, and names of personnel who had come forward. File boxes stacked against every corner contained documentation, original, unredacted copies of training logs, medical records, and communication transcripts that painted a damning picture of systemic abuse. Captain Derek Walsh had become her primary point of contact within the facility's chain of command. Despite his earlier reassignment to administrative duties, Walsh still maintained connections throughout the installation, and more importantly, he had credibility with people who were afraid. When Natasha needed to locate witnesses or verify information, Walsh was the one who knew which doors to knock on and which personnel had information worth hearing. One afternoon, Walsh arrived at her office with a list of names. 17 personnel who had either been injured during training, witnessed serious incidents, or had been reassigned after filing complaints about training conditions. 17 people who had been scattered across the military system, some transferred to different bases, some reassigned to desk jobs, others discharged. The pattern was clear. Holloway didn't silence critics by prosecuting them. He silenced them by scattering them, by moving them out of the facility and away from supporting networks, by making them disappear into the bureaucratic machinery of the military. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. This is going to be challenging, Walsh said, setting the list on Natasha's desk. Some of these people left the military entirely. Some are stationed overseas. But they all have stories. And most of them have been waiting for someone to ask. Natasha began making calls. She used her official authority to request that personnel from other facilities be made available for interviews. She had testimonial authority from the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and no commanding officer wanted to be on record as obstructing a personnel evaluation. Some calls were easier than others. Some required careful explanations about why she needed to speak with people who no longer even worked at the facility. By the end of week 7, she had conducted interviews with 12 of the 17 personnel on Walsh's list. Each interview revealed another layer of the pattern. Each person had experienced or witnessed something that had been classified as an accident, a misunderstanding, or a training incident. But together, the interviews created an undeniable narrative of systematic abuse. Lieutenant James Morrison had broken his arm during a training exercise when Holloway had personally directed a drill that exceeded safe parameters. The incident had been classified as a training accident, and Morrison had been reassigned within weeks. Ensign David Patel had witnessed another trainee lose consciousness during a stress test directed by Holloway. The incident had been quietly handled, the trainee had been discharged, and the matter had been erased from official records. Petty Officer First Class Amanda Reynolds had filed a complaint about excessive force during a hand-to-hand combat session. Her complaint had disappeared. 2 weeks later, she'd been transferred to a facility 3 states away. Each story reinforced the others. Each person represented another piece of evidence that this wasn't random. This was intentional. This was a command structure that had been deliberately designed to protect abuse and punish accountability. But the most significant breakthrough came when Natasha tracked down a retired naval officer named Commander Robert Sullivan. Sullivan had served at the facility for 2 years before Holloway's tenure and had voluntarily transferred out before the general arrived. He was living in civilian life now, working as a security consultant, but he had memories that were crucial to understanding how Holloway's culture of abuse had developed. When I was there, the facility had a different atmosphere entirely, Sullivan explained during their video call. The focus was on building strong warriors through rigorous but fair training. There were high standards, absolutely, but there was also accountability. There was oversight. When trainees were injured, investigations happened. When instructors overstepped, they were corrected. It was a healthy institution. What changed? Natasha asked. General Holloway changed it, Sullivan said. He arrived with a philosophy that the old system was too soft, that military personnel needed to be broken down and rebuilt in a harder mold. He systematized abuse. He created protocols that allowed him to push trainees beyond safe limits while maintaining plausible deniability. He built a network of officers who believed in his methods and protected him. And he scattered anyone who challenged the system. Sullivan agreed to provide a written statement, an official account of how the facility's culture had transformed under Holloway's leadership. This statement would become crucial evidence of intentional institutional change rather than accidental escalation. Over the course of week 8 and 9, more personnel continued to come forward. Some reached out to Natasha directly. Others were identified through the network that Captain Walsh maintained. A training instructor named David Zhang shared detailed notes he'd been keeping about injuries sustained during off-the-books training sessions. A medical corpsman named Jennifer Patterson provided access to medical records that had been deliberately misfiled or incomplete in the official system. An administrative clerk named Robert Thompson produced emails and memos that showed Holloway directly instructing officers to downgrade incident classifications and minimize documentation of injuries. The evidence was becoming irrefutable. It wasn't just one incident or 2 isolated problems. It was a facility-wide system of abuse protected by careful documentation manipulation and strategic reassignment of anyone who posed a threat to Holloway's control. By week 10, Natasha had filled 23 notebooks with interviews and observations. She had compiled a database of 93 documented incidents over 7 years, injuries, accidents, medical emergencies, and deaths that fit a clear pattern. She had statements from 37 personnel willing to testify. She had original documents that contradicted official records. She had emails and memos that showed deliberate manipulation of the truth. But she still needed something more. She needed evidence of the mechanism by which Holloway perpetuated the abuse. She needed documentation of how he'd specifically ordered or directed the incidents that had resulted in death or serious injury. She needed to connect Holloway's actions directly to the harm that had occurred. It was Captain Derek Walsh who identified the final crucial piece of evidence. During a routine records review, he discovered that General Holloway maintained a personal calendar. A detailed log of his daily activities, his training sessions, his interaction with personnel. It was stored in a secure digital system, but Walsh had access to the administrative functions that allowed him to request records retrieval. If we can access this calendar and match it to the dates and times of the most serious incidents, we can prove that Holloway was personally present and personally directing the training that resulted in the most serious injuries, Walsh explained. The calendar request went through official channels. And within 48 hours, Natasha had access to 7 years of General Holloway's detailed daily schedule. Cross-referencing it with the incident documentation, she found something extraordinary. In every single case of serious injury or death, General Holloway's calendar showed that he had personally been present and had personally directed the training session in question. This was no longer circumstantial. This was direct evidence of personal involvement in the incidents that had caused harm. Natasha compiled everything into a comprehensive case file. 23 interview notebooks, 93 documented incidents, 37 willing witnesses, original documents contradicting official records, personal calendar evidence showing Holloway's direct involvement in every serious incident. She sent a secure, encrypted message to Admiral Thornton with a single line. The case is complete. All evidence is irrefutable. Ready to proceed to final phase. Thornton's response came within an hour. Prepare for formal hearing. Timeline to be determined. Maintain absolute security until then. Natasha closed the secure message and looked at the file boxes stacked in her office. Weeks of investigation. Months of work. Testimony from dozens of personnel. Evidence that painted a picture so clear that no one in any position of authority could deny what it showed. General Holloway had built his power on secrecy, on silence, on the assumption that institutional protections would shield him from accountability. But Natasha had systematically dismantled every protection he'd constructed. She'd found the witnesses he thought were scattered beyond reach. She'd located the evidence he thought had been destroyed or hidden. She'd documented the pattern he'd tried so carefully to conceal. The net was closing, and General Holloway had no idea how quickly the evidence was about to crash down on him. Week 11 of the evaluation brought a subtle shift in the facility's atmosphere. General Holloway had grown increasingly suspicious of Natasha's investigation. He watched her movements. He paid attention to which personnel she met with. He noted patterns in her schedule and her interviews. And most importantly, he began to understand that she wasn't simply conducting a routine evaluation. She was systematically building a case against him. This realization manifested in increasing tension. Holloway began appearing more frequently in the training areas when Natasha was observing. He initiated conversations designed to gauge what she'd discovered. He made subtle comments that were clearly intended to intimidate or remind her of his authority. But beneath the surface, Natasha could sense his growing panic. A 3-star general who had operated with complete impunity for 7 years was suddenly aware that someone within his domain was capable of challenging him. Captain Derek Walsh brought her the information on a Thursday afternoon. The general is planning an advanced combat conditioning program tomorrow evening, Walsh said quietly. Off the books. Voluntary participation. It's the kind of session where he typically pushes personnel past safe limits without official oversight. Natasha understood what Walsh was implying. This was an opportunity. How many personnel? She asked. Approximately 20. Junior officers and senior enlisted personnel. It's positioned as an opportunity to prove themselves, to show they have what it takes to be truly elite. Most of them are terrified of saying no. Natasha made a decision. She would attend the training session. Not as an observer standing on the sidelines, but as a participant. She would position herself as someone willing to undergo the same training as the other personnel. And she would deliberately create a situation where General Holloway would feel compelled to demonstrate his authority and his methods directly with her. It was a calculated risk. High-risk confrontation designed to force Holloway to reveal his true nature in a way that couldn't be explained away as misunderstanding or isolated incident. She would bait him into showing exactly what he was capable of when he believed he could act with impunity. She contacted Admiral Thornton that evening through her secure encrypted line. "I'm going to accelerate the timeline," she explained. "I'm attending an off-the-books training session tomorrow night. I'm going to provoke General Holloway into demonstrating his methods directly with me. I want Captain Walsh and I to have recording devices in place." "That's extremely risky," Thornton said. "If he's as dangerous as we suspect, he could seriously hurt you." "He won't," Natasha replied with absolute confidence. "He'll attempt to intimidate me and demonstrate his dominance. But he won't cross the line into something that's obviously criminal, not with me. He's too smart for that. But his attempt will be documented, and it will show the same pattern that every other witness has described." "And if you're wrong?" Thornton asked. "Then I can handle whatever comes," Natasha said simply. The next evening, Natasha arrived at the training facility in civilian athletic clothes, shorts, tank top, running shoes. About 20 personnel were already there, standing in the dim gymnasium. The lights had been dimmed, creating an atmosphere that felt removed from normal base operations. A portable speaker played low, pulsing music. The space felt primal, dangerous, intentional in its design to create psychological pressure. General Holloway stood at the center of the gym, watching as personnel arrived. When he saw Natasha, something flickered across his face. Surprise, perhaps, or satisfaction. The knowledge that his nemesis had walked directly into his domain. "Lieutenant Commander," he said, his voice carrying a dangerous edge of amusement. "I didn't know you were planning to participate in tonight's session. I thought it would be beneficial to experience the facility's advanced training firsthand," Natasha replied evenly. "As part of my comprehensive evaluation." Holloway smiled. It was a predatory smile. "Well then," he said, clapping his hands together. "Let's begin." The session started with intense physical conditioning. Push-ups, burpees, mountain climbers, sprints. Holloway pushed the group hard, but not unusually so. He was testing the waters Natasha understood, observing, waiting to see if she would break or show weakness. She didn't. Her 20 years of military training had prepared her for this. Physical exhaustion was something she'd learned to compartmentalize, to move past. She matched the pace of the personnel around her, maintained her form, showed no signs of distress. After 45 minutes of conditioning, Holloway called the group in. Sweat drenched every participant. Their breathing was heavy. Some looked on the verge of collapse. "Now," Holloway said, his eyes fixed on Natasha, "we move to hand-to-hand combat. I want to demonstrate some advanced techniques. I'll need a volunteer to partner with me." No one moved. The entire group seemed to hold its breath. "Commander Rivera," Holloway said, his tone making it clear it wasn't a request. "Would you like to demonstrate some techniques with me?" This was it. This was the moment. Natasha stepped forward without hesitation. "Of course, General," she said. They took positions on the mat. The rest of the personnel formed a loose circle around them, watching. Hidden in the rafters above, Captain Walsh had positioned a small camera that would capture everything that occurred on the mat. Every move, every contact, every second. Holloway moved with the confidence of a man who had never encountered genuine resistance. He initiated contact, demonstrating holds and techniques, narrating as he went. His movements were controlled but aggressive. He was showing dominance, establishing hierarchy. Then something shifted. Perhaps he noticed the steadiness in Natasha's eyes. Perhaps he saw the absence of fear. Perhaps his ego simply couldn't tolerate the idea that this woman who had embarrassed him in the gymnasium weeks earlier, might actually be capable of matching him. Whatever the reason, Holloway escalated. He executed a throw that was faster than before, more forceful. He followed up with a joint lock that was designed to hurt, to create pain, to demonstrate control. Natasha could feel the pressure on her arm, the deliberate infliction of discomfort. This was no longer instructional demonstration. This was something else. She could have escaped the hold. Her training made that an easy task. Instead, she remained in the hold, maintaining tension but not resisting. She was letting him reveal himself. She was documenting his escalation. She was creating the moment he couldn't deny or explain away. Holloway intensified the pressure. He began talking, his voice carrying an edge of something dark and controlling. "You need to understand something, Commander," he said as he applied more pressure to her arm. "This is my facility. These are my personnel. And you are here at my sufferance. You would be wise not to forget that." The pain was significant now. His intent was clear. He wanted to hurt her. He wanted to demonstrate his power over her. He wanted to make her submit. Natasha made a deliberate decision. She let out a gasp of pain. Not false, the pressure was genuinely causing discomfort, but controlled. She let her body go slightly limp, as if she was surrendering. She wanted him to believe he was winning. She wanted him to feel completely confident in his dominance. "I understand, General," she said, her voice slightly strained. Holloway held the pressure for several more seconds, clearly savoring the moment. Then, apparently satisfied with his demonstration of power, he released her and stepped back. Natasha rolled her shoulders, winced, and rose to her feet. Above, the hidden camera had captured everything. The aggressive escalation, the deliberate infliction of pain, the verbal intimidation, the clear abuse of power. "Interesting technique, General," Natasha said, her voice steady despite the pain radiating through her arm. "Very effective." Holloway smiled, clearly satisfied with what he'd just done. He had no idea that his moment of triumph had just been documented in crystal clear detail. He had no idea that he'd just given Natasha exactly what she needed. "All right," Holloway called to the group, who had watched the entire exchange in stunned silence. "That concludes tonight's session. Dismissed." As personnel filed out, several of them cast Natasha looks of concern and something else, respect. They had just watched her submit to deliberate abuse without breaking, without complaining, without fleeing. Later that night, in her office, Natasha reviewed the footage with Captain Walsh. The camera angle was perfect. The audio was clear. Every moment of Holloway's escalation, his verbal intimidation, his deliberate infliction of pain was captured with absolute clarity. "We have him," Walsh said quietly, watching the footage. "We have him," Natasha confirmed. She photographed the bruises that had developed on her arm. She documented the physical evidence. She created a detailed written account of the evening's events. And then she sent a message to Admiral Thornton. Fresh evidence acquired. Footage of General Holloway's current behavior. Time for final phase. The trap had been set perfectly, and General Holloway had walked directly into it, convinced that he was the predator when, in fact, he had become the prey. The secured conference room at the Pentagon was designed to be completely isolated from external communications. No phones, no internet connections, no possibility of electronic surveillance. It was the kind of space where classified military discussions happened, where sensitive decisions were made away from the reach of anyone who might be monitoring or recording. Admiral Richard Thornton sat at the head of a polished mahogany table. To his right was Colonel Margaret Stevens, the Judge Advocate General's senior legal officer. To his left was Captain James Morrison, the Deputy Inspector General of the Navy. Across from them sat Natasha, still bearing the faint bruising on her arm from the training session. Scattered across the table were sealed evidence envelopes, file folders containing the investigation documentation, a secure laptop, and handwritten notes. The meeting had been scheduled for only 48 hours after the training session. They didn't have much time. Once Holloway realized that Natasha's investigation had become something more than routine evaluation, he would begin destroying evidence and coordinating with his network of loyalists to construct narratives that would shield him from accountability. "Walk us through the evidence," Colonel Stevens said, her pen poised over a legal pad. Natasha began methodically. She presented the timeline of incidents over 7 years. She described each documented case of injury or death. She presented statements from 37 personnel willing to testify. She walked them through the documentation that had been deliberately altered or hidden. She explained the pattern of reassignments that had been used to silence critics. Then she showed them the footage from the training session. The video played silently on the secured laptop. General Holloway's aggressive demonstration, the escalation that moved from instructional to abusive, the deliberate infliction of pain, the verbal intimidation, every moment captured in clear, undeniable detail. The timestamp shows this occurred on the date and at the time indicated? Colonel Stevens asked, making notes. Yes, Natasha confirmed. Captain Derek Walsh positioned the recording device. The metadata is intact and verifiable. And you had discussed with Admiral Thornton that you would be attending this session and attempting to create a situation where General Holloway would demonstrate his typical methods? I had, Natasha said. This was a deliberately orchestrated scenario designed to capture evidence of General Holloway's behavior, Stevens said, her tone neutral but her implication clear. This made the evidence potentially admissible and definitely powerful as documentation of Holloway's character and methods. Captain Morrison leaned forward, studying the bruising on Natasha's arm. Did he cause you any permanent injury? No, Natasha replied. Significant pain and temporary bruising. Nothing that required medical attention. But the intent to cause pain was clear. That's important, Morrison said. It shows restraint on his part even in escalation, which suggests premeditation rather than spontaneous anger. He knew what he was doing and chose to do it anyway. Colonel Stevens set down her pen and removed her reading glasses. Let me be very clear about what I'm seeing here. We have multiple credible witnesses with detailed accounts of a pattern of abuse spanning 7 years. We have documentary evidence including original unredacted records and calendar documentation. We have video evidence of General Holloway deliberately escalating to inflicting pain on a subordinate officer. We have expert testimony from retired officers about institutional change. And we have personnel who are willing to testify publicly under oath. She paused, letting her words settle. This is not a he said she said situation. This is not a case where plausible deniability exists. This is overwhelming documentation of systematic abuse of power by a commanding officer. What about his defenders? Captain Morrison asked. He's a 3-star general with 7 years of successful operational command at this facility. He has officers who support his methods. He has personnel who will testify that they believed the training was rigorous but fair. His defenders will say that, Colonel Stevens agreed, and will examine their testimony carefully. But the question becomes whether their testimony outweighs the testimony of 37 personnel who describe a different experience. Whether their perspective outweighs the objective documentation we've compiled. The answer is no, it doesn't. Admiral Thornton had been quiet during this exchange, simply listening and observing. Now he spoke. The critical question is whether we have enough to move forward to formal proceedings, he said. Not enough to convict in a criminal court. That's not what we're doing here. But enough to warrant a formal investigation with the authority to suspend Holloway's command pending the outcome of that investigation. Yes, Colonel Stevens said without hesitation. We have absolutely enough for that. In fact, I would argue that we have an obligation to suspend him immediately. Every day he remains in command is another day where personnel could be at risk, where evidence could be destroyed, where witnesses could be intimidated into silence. Morrison nodded in agreement. The video evidence alone is sufficient justification for immediate suspension of command pending investigation. Combined with everything else, it's overwhelming. Thornton turned to Natasha. You understand what comes next? Yes, she said. My evaluation will transition from fact-finding to formal charges. General Holloway will be informed that he's under investigation. He'll be suspended from command. There will be media attention. His network of supporters will begin circling wagons and constructing alternative narratives. It's going to get ugly. It is, Thornton confirmed. Which is why we need to be absolutely certain of our next steps. We need to ensure that the personnel who've cooperated with this investigation are protected from retaliation. We need to ensure that the evidence remains secure. We need to coordinate with other agencies to ensure that any attempt Holloway makes to destroy evidence or intimidate witnesses is documented and prosecuted separately. Colonel Stevens began making detailed notes. I'll need to brief the Inspector General's office. We'll need to coordinate with the Navy's law enforcement. We'll need to brief the Secretary of the Navy. This is going to trigger a formal investigation and probable disciplinary proceedings. What about criminal charges? Natasha asked. Stevens looked up from her notes. That depends on whether any of the incidents we're investigating constitute criminal behavior versus military misconduct. The death of Captain Reeves, if we can prove that Holloway deliberately sabotaged the rappelling equipment, that becomes murder or at minimum manslaughter. The injuries and abuse that he deliberately inflicted, those could be assault charges. The obstruction and cover-up, those could be conspiracy charges. But we need to be careful. We have strong circumstantial evidence, but we need to ensure that our allegations are rock solid before we move into criminal territory. So where does that leave us? Natasha asked. It leaves us moving forward with military disciplinary proceedings based on the overwhelming evidence of command abuse and misconduct, Thornton said. The criminal side will develop as the investigation proceeds, but our primary focus is removing him from command and ensuring accountability within the military justice system. The criminal aspects can be referred to appropriate authorities if warranted. Morrison began organizing the files. I'll take custody of all evidence. Everything gets logged, secured, and transferred to the Inspector General's evidence vault. Nothing leaves this room without proper documentation and chain of custody procedures. What about the personnel who cooperated? Natasha asked. Major Chin, Captain Walsh, Petty Officer Hendricks, Lieutenant Mackenzie. They're all at risk if Holloway realizes they've testified against him. That's why we're moving immediately, Thornton said. We brief Holloway on suspension of command, effective immediately. He's escorted from the facility. His access to communications is restricted pending the investigation. We simultaneously brief the personnel at the facility about the investigation, making clear that retaliation against witnesses is a federal offense. We move so fast that Holloway doesn't have time to organize a counteroffensive. Colonel Stevens added a note to her legal pad. I'll prepare the paperwork for the Inspector General. Suspension of command. Seizure of all personal files and communications. Restriction of access to military facilities. And we'll need to issue a directive protecting witnesses from retaliation. Over the next 3 hours, they worked through every aspect of the transition from investigation to formal proceedings. They reviewed each piece of evidence. They discussed witness protection. They talked through the media strategy. They established protocols for ensuring that evidence remained secure and that witnesses remained safe. By the time the meeting ended, a clear plan had been established. In 72 hours, General Holloway would be informed of his suspension from command. The investigation would become public knowledge. The evidence would be handed over to official authorities for formal disciplinary proceedings. The trap was about to be sprung. Natasha left the Pentagon that evening with a sense of profound purpose. Weeks of careful investigation, months of gathering evidence. And now, finally, the moment of accountability was approaching. She thought about Captain Reeves. She thought about Lieutenant Mackenzie. She thought about all the personnel who had been scattered across the military system, silenced by fear and institutional inertia. They were about to have their stories heard. They were about to have their experiences validated. They were about to see justice unfold. General Patricia Holloway had spent 7 years operating with the confidence that his rank and his network would protect him indefinitely. He had no idea that in 72 hours, everything he'd built on silence and fear was about to collapse. The evidence was verified. The case was complete. And the final phase was about to begin. The official notification was delivered on a Tuesday morning at 0800 hours. General Patricia Holloway was summoned to the office of the base commander, Rear Admiral Thomas Wellington. The summons was brief and formal. No explanation, No context, just a direct order to report immediately. Natasha watched from a distance as Holloway entered Wellington's office. She was positioned in a secure area where she could observe but not be observed, part of the coordinated effort to ensure that Holloway didn't have an opportunity to flee or destroy evidence. Naval security personnel had been positioned throughout the facility, ostensibly for routine security operations but actually there to ensure that critical personnel remained on base until formal proceedings could begin. Inside Wellington's office, Holloway's world was about to change irrevocably. "General Holloway," Wellington began, his voice formal and official. "I'm here to inform you that you are being suspended from command effective immediately, pending a comprehensive investigation into allegations of command misconduct, abuse of authority, and conduct unbecoming an officer." Holloway's face went pale. "What allegations? By whom?" "Those details will be provided to you by the Inspector General's office," Wellington said. "Your access to classified materials is hereby revoked. Your access to military facilities is restricted to those required for investigative interviews. You are directed to surrender all personal files, all communications devices, and all documentation related to facility operations. You will be accompanied by a security officer during the transition of your command to Acting Commander Major Catherine Chun, effective immediately." The words hit Holloway like physical blows. Suspension of command, investigation, loss of access, loss of authority. Everything he'd built, everything he'd protected through years of careful manipulation, was collapsing in a matter of minutes. "This is outrageous," Holloway said, his voice rising. "I have served this military with distinction for 32 years. You have no basis for these accusations. The investigation will determine the validity of the allegations," Wellington replied coolly. "You have the right to legal representation. You will be provided with details of the charges and the evidence against you. You have the right to respond to those charges. But for now, you are suspended from command." A naval security officer entered the office. Holloway was given 30 minutes to pack his personal belongings from his office. He was escorted from the facility by the security officer, his access badge deactivated, his authority stripped, his career in free fall. By noon, the entire facility knew that General Holloway had been suspended from command. By 1300 hours, Major Catherine Chun had formally assumed command of the facility, and she immediately began implementing changes. The first change was an all-hands briefing where she announced that the facility's training protocols were being immediately revised pending the outcome of the comprehensive investigation. She announced new safety procedures. She announced mandatory reporting mechanisms for any personnel who witnessed misconduct. She announced that any retaliation against witnesses or personnel who cooperated with the investigation would result in immediate prosecution. Word spread like wildfire. Personnel who had been terrified to speak now understood that Holloway was no longer in a position to threaten them. Personnel who had been reassigned to other facilities and had given up hope of accountability now understood that there was legitimacy to the investigation. Personnel who had been silenced by fear understood that their silence was no longer necessary. Within hours, the legal documentation began flowing. Colonel Margaret Stevens filed the formal notice of investigation with the Inspector General's office. Captain James Morrison activated the investigative procedures that would launch a full review of Holloway's command practices. The Secretary of the Navy was briefed on the situation and authorized the immediate creation of a formal review board to oversee the investigation. The media, smelling a significant story, began asking questions. Initial reports were cautious, Navy general suspended pending investigation, but journalists quickly began digging deeper, discovering the breadth of allegations and the significance of what was being uncovered. Natasha completed her formal evaluation report and submitted it to Admiral Thornton. The report was comprehensive, detailed, and damning. It documented 93 incidents over 7 years. It presented testimony from 37 personnel. It included the video evidence from the training session. It included analysis of documentation alterations and facility records manipulation. It presented a clear narrative of systematic abuse protected by institutional mechanisms designed to conceal truth and punish accountability. The report's conclusion was unequivocal. The evidence presented in this evaluation demonstrates a clear and sustained pattern of command abuse, misconduct, and violation of military protocols regarding personnel safety. General Patricia Holloway's leadership of the Consolidated Defense Training Center has resulted in serious injury to multiple personnel, the death of at least one officer under circumstances that warrant criminal investigation, and the systematic cover-up of incidents through documentation manipulation and intimidation of witnesses. This evaluation recommends immediate and permanent removal from command, thorough criminal investigation, and disciplinary proceedings. The report was classified and distributed only to authorized personnel, but its findings became the basis for the formal investigation that was now underway. 3 days after Holloway's suspension, Captain Derek Walsh arrived at Natasha's temporary office. He was no longer an administrator confined to desk duties. With Holloway removed from command and Major Chun taking over, Walsh had been reassigned to his previous position as a senior training officer. His career, which had been effectively over when he'd been sidelined for questioning Holloway's methods, had been resurrected. "The personnel are talking," Walsh said without preamble. "Now that they know Holloway is actually going to face consequences, people are coming forward. People who were too afraid before. We have at least a dozen more witness statements from personnel who are willing to go on record." "Are they willing to testify formally?" Natasha asked. "Yes, and not just about what they witnessed, but about the intimidation and retaliation they faced when they tried to report problems. That's actually a separate set of charges against Holloway. Witness intimidation and retaliation for reporting misconduct." Natasha made notes. Each new witness statement strengthened the case. Each person willing to testify publicly made it harder for Holloway to construct any narrative that would allow him to escape accountability. Lieutenant Sarah Mackenzie submitted a formal written account of her experience during the training session where she'd collapsed. She requested victim impact status in the investigation. Petty Officer First Class Amanda Reynolds provided documentation of her transfer request, and the communications that showed her transfer had been deliberately punitive. Personnel who had been discharged or reassigned months or years earlier began submitting historical accounts of incidents they'd witnessed or experienced. The momentum was irreversible now. The investigation had become public. The evidence had become undeniable. The narrative had shifted from "General Holloway runs a rigorous but fair training facility" to "General Holloway oversaw a facility where systematic abuse was protected by institutional corruption." Holloway retained legal representation, a high-powered civilian attorney who began making public statements about the allegations being exaggerated and the investigation being politically motivated. But the attorney's statements carried no weight. The documentation was too extensive. The witnesses were too numerous. The evidence was too clear. By the end of the second week after Holloway's suspension, the Inspector General's office had formally notified him that he was the subject of a comprehensive investigation into command misconduct. The notification included an outline of the allegations, 93 documented incidents over 7 years, systematic abuse of personnel, cover-up of injuries and deaths, witness intimidation, documentation manipulation, and violation of military safety protocols. The notification further advised him that as a 3-star general, he had the right to request a hearing before the formal review board that would determine whether charges would be filed and proceedings initiated. The hearing would be conducted with full transparency. Witnesses would be permitted to testify. Evidence would be presented. He would have the opportunity to respond to all allegations. The hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks away. That gave Natasha's team time to prepare the presentation of evidence, to ensure that all witnesses were prepared to testify, and to organize the documentation in a way that would be impossible for the review board to ignore or dismiss. General Holloway's world had been turned upside down in the matter of 3 days. From commanding officer operating with complete authority and impunity to suspended general facing the possibility of criminal prosecution and permanent removal from the military. From someone whose power was absolute within his domain to someone whose career had been placed in the hands of a formal investigation process. He had no idea what was coming. He had no idea that the review board hearing would be the moment where all the evidence, all the testimony, and all the documentation would be presented in a public forum with media attention and official scrutiny. The trap had been sprung. The point of no return had been passed. And now, all that remained was for the formal proceedings to unfold and for justice to finally be served. The formal review board hearing was scheduled for 0900 hours on a Tuesday morning in the Grand Conference Chamber at the Pentagon. The room had been specifically chosen for its size and official gravitas. High ceilings, formal lighting, a raised dais where the review board members would sit, and rows of seats for observers, media, and support personnel. The three-member review board consisted of Vice Admiral Eleanor Harrison, the Navy's Deputy Inspector General, Major General David Kumar, a Marine Corps general with no previous connection to Holloway, and Rear Admiral Susan Mitchell, the Navy's Chief Legal Officer. These individuals had been selected specifically because they had no institutional ties to Holloway and no vested interest in protecting him. Their sole responsibility was to evaluate the evidence, hear testimony, and determine whether sufficient grounds existed to file formal charges against the suspended general. The room began filling at 0800 hours. Media representatives occupied the front rows. Military personnel and observers filled additional seats. Captain Derek Walsh sat with a protective hand on Petty Officer Hendrick's shoulder. Major Catherine Chun sat in her capacity as the new facility commander. Lieutenant Sarah Mackenzie sat with her hands folded, her young face composed but visibly nervous. Petty Officer First Class Amanda Reynolds sat with her jaw set, her eyes fixed forward. Natasha sat in the front row, directly behind the prosecution table. Her dress uniform was immaculate. The two tridents on her uniform, her own and a replica of Captain Michael Reeves' insignia, caught the light. Some observers would recognize the significance. Others would wonder. But the message was clear. This was about honoring the fallen while seeking justice for the living. General Patricia Holloway sat at the defense table with his civilian attorney, a sharp-featured man named Richard Blackwood. Holloway's appearance had changed in the 3 weeks since his suspension. He looked diminished, his uniform hanging slightly loose on his frame, his face lined with stress. The confidence that had once radiated from him was gone, replaced by a careful, calculated neutrality. Vice Admiral Harrison called the hearing to order at precisely 0900 hours. This is a formal review board hearing into allegations of command misconduct, abuse of authority, and conduct unbecoming an officer against General Patricia Holloway, Harrison announced, her voice carrying through the chamber. This hearing is convened under Military Regulation 5-31C and is authorized by the Secretary of the Navy. General Holloway, you have the right to legal representation, which I see you have exercised. You have the right to respond to all allegations. You have the right to call witnesses on your behalf. Do you understand your rights? I do, ma'am, Holloway replied, his voice steady but lacking its former authority. We will begin with presentation of evidence and witness testimony from the investigating officer, Lieutenant Commander Natasha Rivera. Lieutenant Commander, please proceed. Natasha stood and approached the presentation area. For the next 4 hours, she systematically presented the evidence that had been compiled over the past 3 months. She began with the timeline of incidents, 93 documented cases over 7 years. She presented the video evidence from the training session, pausing at key moments to highlight Holloway's escalation and the deliberate infliction of pain. As the video played on the large screen, observers in the hearing room visibly reacted. The evidence was stark, undeniable, and deeply troubling. A general officer deliberately hurting a subordinate. Commander abusing his power. The very thing that military discipline was supposed to prevent. Natasha then presented the documentary evidence. Original unredacted training logs. Medical records showing the severity of injuries that had been classified as minor incidents. Calendar documentation showing Holloway's personal presence at every major incident. Emails showing deliberate manipulation of incident classifications. Memos showing instructions to alter documentation. Attorney Blackwood objected repeatedly, arguing that some evidence was inadmissible, that procedures hadn't been followed correctly, that the presentation was prejudicial. Vice Admiral Harrison overruled each objection with increasing firmness, making clear that the review board was not bound by the strict evidentiary rules that would apply in a criminal trial. The board's purpose was to determine whether sufficient evidence existed to warrant formal charges, and that evidence was overwhelming. By midday, Natasha had presented the physical evidence. In the afternoon, the witnesses began testifying. Petty Officer Second Class Marcus Hendricks took the stand first. He described the training sessions where Holloway personally oversaw exercises that pushed trainees beyond safe limits. He described witnessing injuries. He described the culture of fear. He described being terrified to report problems because of what had happened to other people who challenged the system. Captain Derek Walsh testified about his observations of the rappelling tower incident. He described noticing that the harness had been tampered with. He described reporting it to Holloway and being told it was equipment failure. He described filing a formal complaint and watching that complaint disappear from the system. Lieutenant Sarah Mackenzie testified about the training session where she'd collapsed. Her voice shook as she described the physical distress she was experiencing. The way Holloway had ignored her statements that she needed to stop. The way he'd pushed her past the point of safety. The way his first concern when she collapsed wasn't her health but containing the incident. Petty Officer First Class Amanda Reynolds testified about filing a complaint and being immediately reassigned to another facility. She described how her career had effectively been ended because she tried to report misconduct. Commander Robert Sullivan, the retired officer, testified via secure video conference about the facility's transformation under Holloway's leadership. He described how the facility's culture had changed from one that valued rigorous but fair training to one that tolerated abuse. Major Catherine Chun took the stand and testified about her 18-year relationship with Holloway. She described watching him change. She described knowing about problems but being afraid to act. She broke down slightly when describing Captain Reeves' death and her conviction that it was not an accident. She described providing Holloway with documentation from her personal files because she could no longer live with the silence. As witness after witness testified, the reality of Holloway's command became undeniably clear. This wasn't a case of isolated incidents or misunderstandings. This was a pattern of sustained abuse protected by institutional mechanisms designed to conceal truth. During cross-examination, Attorney Blackwood attempted to undermine the witnesses. He suggested they were misremembering. He implied they had personal vendettas against Holloway. He argued that training was inherently tough and that what the witnesses described was simply rigorous instruction being mistaken for abuse. But his strategy backfired. Each witness remained calm and composed under cross-examination. Each one provided specific details that couldn't be fabricated. Each one maintained their composure even when Blackwood became aggressive in his questioning. On the second day of the hearing, General Holloway was given the opportunity to present his defense. He testified in his own behalf, arguing that his training methods were consistent with military doctrine, that injuries were regrettable but inevitable in combat training, and that he had never deliberately abused any personnel. He claimed the video evidence showed a misunderstanding, a moment where a training exercise had been mistaken for something more sinister. But when Attorney Blackwood played portions of the video again, Holloway's testimony fell apart. The evidence of deliberate escalation was too clear. The evidence of pain being deliberately inflicted was too obvious. His own words on the video, "You need to understand something, Commander. This is my facility," sounded like exactly what they were, an abuse of power. Holloway called several character witnesses to testify on his behalf. Officers who had served under him and claimed that his training methods had been effective and fair. But their testimony was undermined by the documentary evidence and the sheer number of people who came forward to describe a very different experience. By the end of the second day, the hearing had essentially concluded. Vice Admiral Harrison announced that the review board would deliberate overnight and would issue its findings the following morning. That evening, Natasha sat alone in her temporary quarters. She thought about Captain Michael Reeves. She thought about all the personnel who had been injured, silenced, or driven from the military because they tried to do the right thing. She thought about the 7 years that Holloway had operated with impunity, the 7 years that could have been prevented if someone had simply acted sooner. At 0900 hours the next morning, the hearing room was completely full. Media, observers, personnel who wanted to witness the conclusion of this unprecedented case against a three-star general. Vice Admiral Harrison entered with the other review board members and took their seats. The room fell completely silent. This review board has examined the evidence and heard testimony regarding the allegations against General Patricia Holloway, Harrison began. Our findings are as follows. We find sufficient evidence to warrant formal charges of command misconduct, abuse of authority, conduct unbecoming an officer, and violation of military safety protocols. We further find that the evidence warrants referral to the appropriate civilian authorities for potential criminal investigation into the death of Captain Michael Reeves and the deliberate infliction of harm against subordinate personnel. She paused, letting those words settle. General Patricia Holloway is hereby removed from active duty pending formal military disciplinary proceedings. His general officer rank is suspended pending the outcome of those proceedings. He is remanded into custody pending determination of bail status by appropriate authorities. Holloway's face went white. His attorney immediately stood to lodge objections, but they were meaningless. The board had spoken. The evidence had been too overwhelming. The testimony had been too credible. As security officers approached to place Holloway in custody, he finally looked directly at Natasha. For just a moment their eyes met, and in that moment, she saw the dawning realization in his expression. This woman he'd tried to intimidate, this woman he'd tried to strike, this woman he'd underestimated completely, had brought him down. She held his gaze steadily, and in that look was everything. The memory of Captain Reeves, the pain of the personnel who'd been hurt, the cost of standing up for truth, and the ultimate vindication that comes when justice finally arrives. As Holloway was led from the courtroom, the impact of the moment settled over everyone present. A three-star general had been formally charged. The review board had found overwhelming evidence of abuse. The truth had been brought into the light, and the woman who had made it possible sat perfectly still, her uniform immaculate, her expression composed, knowing that the fight wasn't over but that an important milestone had been reached. Justice was beginning to be served. 6 months after the review board hearing, the Consolidated Defense Training Center looked completely different from the facility that Natasha had first arrived at nearly a year earlier. The physical infrastructure remained the same obstacle courses, the same gymnasium, the same training towers. But the culture that permeated the facility had been fundamentally transformed. Major Catherine Chun stood in her office, Holloway's former office, now repurposed and reimagined, looking at the facility's new training protocols manual. Every page had been rewritten. Every procedure had been revised. Every principle had been realigned to reflect a philosophy that rigorous training and ethical treatment of personnel were not mutually exclusive. They were, in fact, inseparable. The most significant change came with the appointment of Natasha Rivera as the facility's new deputy commander. It was an unprecedented move, moving a lieutenant commander into a position typically held by a captain, but it was absolutely intentional. The Navy wanted to send a clear message. The woman who had uncovered the corruption, who had risked her career and her safety to expose the truth, was now in a position of authority to ensure that the facility operated with integrity. Natasha's first official act had been to establish a memorial to Captain Michael Reeves. A brass plaque was mounted on the wall of the facility's main training hall, engraved with his name, his service record, and his favorite quote, "The mark of a true warrior is the integrity with which they lead others." The memorial served as a constant reminder of why the changes had been made and what had been lost because of the previous culture of abuse. Personnel assignments had been systematically restructured. Officers who had been loyal to Holloway and had participated in covering up his misconduct had been transferred or reassigned. Petty Officer Marcus Hendricks had been promoted and was now serving as one of the facility's lead training coordinators, designing drills that challenged personnel physically without crossing into abuse. Captain Derek Walsh had been restored to his full duties and had become one of the most respected training officers at the facility, known for his commitment to both excellence and ethical conduct. Petty Officer First Class Amanda Reynolds had requested reassignment back to the facility after hearing about the changes. She was now serving as the facility's personnel safety officer, responsible for ensuring that all training protocols met or exceeded military safety standards. Her presence was powerful, a statement that the facility valued the people who had been willing to challenge the system. Lieutenant Sarah Mackenzie had been assigned to the facility as well, and she had become one of the most dedicated junior officers in the command. She volunteered for the most challenging training assignments, proving to herself and to others that her earlier collapse had not diminished her capabilities or her worth. She was determined to become the kind of officer who would mentor younger personnel with both rigor and respect. The facility's new training philosophy was explicit and formal. Warriors were not built through fear, pain, or intimidation. Warriors were built through challenging training conducted with clear safety parameters, with respect for personnel, and with a commitment to developing not just physical capability but moral character. The fiercest fighters, the philosophy stated, were those who understood that true strength came from discipline, integrity, and the ability to lead others without resorting to brutality. Training was still demanding. Trainees still experienced physical hardship, but they experienced it in an environment where their safety was genuinely prioritized, where their complaints were genuinely heard, and where the goal was to build them up rather than break them down. 3 months into the transformation, Natasha conducted a facility-wide training on the new protocols. She spoke to every personnel group, officers, enlisted personnel, instructors, administrative staff. She talked about the importance of maintaining standards while respecting the people who were being trained. She talked about the cost of silence in the face of misconduct. She talked about the courage required to speak truth even when doing so was risky. This facility was once a place where excellence was used as a justification for abuse, she told the assembled personnel, where high standards became an excuse for cruelty, where the pursuit of strength became a reason to harm people. That era is over. And it's over because people were willing to stand up and say that what was happening here was wrong. She paused, letting her gaze sweep across the room. Captain Michael Reeves paid the ultimate price for trying to do the right thing. Dozens of other personnel were injured, traumatized, or driven from the military because they questioned the system. Their suffering wasn't necessary. Their pain didn't make them stronger. It just made them victims of institutional corruption. She spoke about the importance of creating an environment where personnel could report problems without fear of retaliation. She spoke about the responsibility of leaders to protect those under their command. She spoke about the difference between discipline and abuse, between high standards and cruelty. The Navy SEALs have a saying, Natasha told them. The only easy day was yesterday. That's true. This work is hard. Training in this facility should be hard. But hard doesn't have to mean cruel. Excellence doesn't require abuse. And if you ever encounter a leader who suggests otherwise, you have a responsibility to report it, to challenge it, and to ensure that the system responds appropriately. The new anonymous reporting system that had been implemented made it possible for personnel to report misconduct without fear of retaliation. An independent office reviewed all reports. Investigations were conducted with external oversight. Retaliation against people who filed reports was treated as a separate federal offense with severe consequences. In the facility's first year under new leadership, 7 reports of minor misconduct came through the system. Each one was investigated thoroughly. Each one resulted in corrective action or discipline as appropriate. But more importantly, none of them resulted in retaliation against the person who filed the report. The system worked. The culture had genuinely changed. Admiral Richard Thornton visited the facility 6 months after the hearing. He stood in the training hall, looking at the plaque dedicated to Captain Reeves. Natasha stood beside him. You did something extraordinary here, Thornton said quietly. You took an institution that was fundamentally broken and you helped fix it. More than that, you ensured that the person responsible for the corruption faced accountability. Do you understand how rare that is? I do, Natasha replied. Most of the time, rank and institutional protection shield people like Holloway from consequences. Exactly, Thornton said. But you didn't accept that. You built a case that was so overwhelming, so irrefutable, that institutional protection couldn't shield him. And in doing so, you sent a message throughout the military that commanders who abuse their authority will face consequences. Holloway's formal court-martial was scheduled to begin in another 6 months. The evidence was so overwhelming that his civilian attorney had been exploring plea agreements that might reduce his sentence. The criminal charges related to Captain Reeves' death were particularly serious. The prosecution had evidence that Holloway had deliberately sabotaged the rappelling equipment, which would constitute premeditated murder. But regardless of the outcome of the court-martial, Holloway's career was over. His general officer rank had been permanently suspended. He had been removed from the military. He would spend the rest of his life dealing with the consequences of his actions. More importantly, the facility he had corrupted had been reclaimed. The culture he had poisoned had been cleansed. The institution he had abused was healing. One afternoon, Natasha stood alone in the training hall, looking at Captain Reeves' memorial plaque. She thought about the journey that had led her here. 20 years of service, decades of proving herself in spaces where she wasn't supposed to exist, and ultimately the decision to risk everything to expose the truth. She thought about the personnel who had found the courage to speak up despite their fear. She thought about Captain Walsh, who had maintained his integrity even when it had cost him his career advancement. She thought about Major Chun, who had finally found the courage to break her silence. She thought about all the young officers and enlisted personnel who would now be trained in an environment that valued their well-being as much as it valued their development. The facility's transformation was complete. But the real work, the work of maintaining that transformation, of ensuring that the new culture was sustained over time, of continuing to challenge any tendency toward the old patterns of abuse, that work would continue indefinitely. Natasha understood that now. Justice wasn't a destination. It was a process. Accountability wasn't something that happened once and then was finished. It was something that required constant vigilance, constant commitment, and constant willingness to stand up for what was right. As she turned to leave the training hall, Natasha glanced one more time at the memorial plaque. The afternoon light caught the brass, making it gleam. "Thank you," she whispered, speaking to Captain Reeves, to all the personnel who had suffered, and to the institution that was finally beginning to heal. The story of General Patricia Holloway's facility had become a case study in military leadership, a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked authority, and an inspiring story about the power of one person willing to stand up for truth. Natasha Rivera had entered that facility as an investigator. She was leaving it as a reformer, a leader, and a symbol of what was possible when courage met commitment to justice. She had changed the facility. But more importantly, she had changed the conversation within the military about what kind of leadership was acceptable and what kind of leaders would be held accountable for their abuse of power. Her work at the Consolidated Defense Training Center was entering its final phase. Soon, she would move on to other assignments, other challenges, other opportunities to serve. But the legacy she had created here would endure. The memorial to Captain Reeves would endure. The changed culture would endure. And the message would endure. That true strength comes not from brutality, but from integrity. That the fiercest warriors are those who lead with respect. And that in the military, just as in life, standing up for what is right, no matter the cost, is always the right choice. Captain Michael Reeves' death had not been in vain. His sacrifice had led to transformation. His memory had become the foundation for a better institution. And that was the legacy that would outlast them all. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.